Hello and welcome back to the Alnwick Castle Podcast. I'm Daniel Watkins.
And I'm Deborah Beecroft.
And on today's episode, we're going back to the world of medieval artisans to find out about the art of the Scriptorium and illuminated manuscripts.
We're joined by Karen from the Company of Artisans, making her third appearance on the podcast to tell us all about this fascinating craft and the work that went into producing it.
Here's our conversation with Karen. Please enjoy.
We're very happy to welcome back one of our favourite guests to the Alnwick Castle Podcast. From the Company of Artisans, it's Karen, aka Kate Tyler. How are you today?
Hello, Deborah. I'm fine, thank you.
Good. So today we're going to talk with you about Scriptorium and
Yep.
illuminated manuscripts.
Yep.
So let's start with the most basic question. What is a Scriptorium?
What is a scriptorium? A scriptorium is a place where the preparation of books and manuscripts would happen. So most often in history that was in a monastic environment, because that was where most of the seats of learning were in medieval Europe. They were the people who were educated, they taught. And so they were also where book production was taking place. Because as a part of a monastery, it's basically an industry. It's a little city in itself in a monastery. So you've got all of the products that you need to create a book. The main one is the substrate that you're writing on, which is sheepskin. So monastic environment was ideal for this because part of the monastery lands that they had, the tenants on the monastic lands, they had sheep. So as well as them producing wool and creating wool sacks that then get weighed and sold in the monastery, and the meat that people are eating, they're producing the bit that's in the middle of the meat and the wool, which is the parchment or the vellum. So that's being produced and consumed by monasteries in order to create books, because paper, as we know it, which was made of linen, very early paper was made of linen, that wasn't being used in this country much before about 1300. It is being used for books, but not commonly, and it wasn't being made in this country until 1490 in Hereford was the first paper mill in this country. So our paper was being bought from Switzerland and from Italy, was very expensive. There's lots of tax records for imports from Italy for paper. So monastic lands were used to raise the sheep. They're creating the parchment, they're then scraping the parchment and collating the parchment into bound copies of books, which are then being written on and drawn on to make scripts, and they're calling that a scriptorium. So you see these rooms noted down. Sometimes they're adjacent to libraries, but they're where copies of books are being produced. So these are books that have been produced many, many times. So you've got different books of the Bible. You've got psalters, which is actually spelled with a P, so P-S, psalter, silent P. And then all of the other documents that are needed to run a monastery, because it's a business. So you've got all of the tax records, you've got all the land ownership records, and then they're also keeping records for things like landed gentry, for their heraldry, their birth, their sort of dynastic line, and they're producing books for the local landowners. So people like here at Alnwick Castle, they would have been reliant on the local scriptorium, the local monasteries, to help them with their recording of all of the events that are happening within the monastery. So they're buying copies of books from them, they're commissioning copies of books. They're often commissioning books to send as gifts to people that they want to have favour with. So if they're looking to do a marriage in particular, you get a lot of these surviving copies of books of hours and psalters that are known by the lady's name, a woman's name, or someone who's collected it or someone who's commissioned it. And very often those are being written as part of a marriage. So as part of an agreement for a marriage, they are commissioning a holy book that they will have often as a private book that they are reading. And so it might be a prayer book, it might be a book of poetry or psalms, which are religious poems. And these are illuminated and beautifully decorated because they're thought of as a holy thing. They are almost like a relic, some of them, and they're being kept in beautiful cabinets and bindings. So the binding often is more valuable than the book itself, and the books are very, very valuable. They cost a lot of money. So yeah, Scriptorium, as I know it, is somewhere where all of the processes of creating a book are carried out. So whether that's the writing, the preparation of the ink, the preparation of the manuscript itself, and then the binding, and then the preparation of the paints, and then the decoration, the painting, and then finally sort of binding that into the outer case. And often the outer case is made of wood and bound with metal, so they are locked, so they're lockable, these things. And they're quite rare. They're not something that ordinary people would have, these books. They're something that are kept for the gentry, for the landed gentry, and they are kept and swapped in amongst monastic communities, different communities. So, and because they're writing in Latin, these are books that can be read by monasteries and people in all the countries of Europe, because they're all, if you're learned and you are and you have your letters and you know how to read and write, the language that you're reading and writing in is most often Latin. And that's one of the reasons why people like Cuthbert, people who are known in the north of England here, people like Bede, when they're writing, some of the scripts they're writing are in Latin, but often some of them are actually in English or Anglo-Saxon, Old English. And the reason that they're writing in both languages is the young monks that are coming to learn how to read and write Latin, they are being taught with their own language. So the language of Old English, Anglo-Saxon, that is being written down and texts are being translated. So they're being given a primer in Latin with it written in Old English first, in Anglo-Saxon first, so the language that they're actually speaking. So this is why we have these rare survivals of written Anglo-Saxon, which was a verbal language. It wasn't written down very much. The documents that survive in Anglo-Saxon really only survive because they're documents that are also being written in Latin as a way of translating, as a way of helping young monks and nuns to understand written and read Latin. So that's one of the bonuses that you get from these places of learning, these scriptoriums, is that they're a way of capturing what would otherwise be an unknown language.
You mentioned illuminated manuscripts. What makes a manuscript an illuminated manuscript?
An illuminated manuscript is a decorative manuscript. It's a decorated manuscript. It's decorated beyond just the beginning letters of each sentence being written in red. You get these big banks of text written out, and an illuminated manuscript has a large frontispiece, which is very often just one word. And that is very highly decorated, and it's decorated with precious minerals and gold. So it has gold on it. So examples of illuminated manuscripts that people may have heard of are the Lindisfarne Gospels, the Book of Kells, books that are known because they are so highly decorated. They are works of art in themselves, and they are a way of transforming the written word into art, basically. So they use a lot of the art forms and mannerisms that you see in other forms of art of that period. So with the Lindisfarne Gospels, and particularly the Book of Kells, you've got this Celtic script, you've got this Celtic illumination where you've got these interwoven initials, these little animals that are concealed, and they've got great tails, and they're plaited, and they weave in and out, and the sort of decoration that you otherwise see in stone carvings. So it's a way of them transforming what is the Word of God into something that is a venerated object. It's a holy object. It's something that is not just a book that you would have and slip into your pocket and read at your bedside. This is something that takes pride of place and is venerated and is only used and got out on special occasions. So the reason that the Scriptorium would perhaps be involved in this is that these take many, many years to produce. They're not just something that are written. You know, a scribe could write pages in a day. An ordinary scribe can write pages in a day. But to carry out this illuminated process, there are many different parts of that. So there's the lining out, there's the setting out of the design, there's the inking, then there's the painting, the colouring, and then finally there's the gilding. So there's many different steps to this before you've got a finished illuminated page in your manuscript.
And would all of those be done by the same person, or would it be multiple?
There are many people involved. There's a whole team involved because they've each got different skills, and you can sometimes tell the handwriting, and the handwriting changes. You very often see in some of the lesser ones, not really the Book of Kells, but you very often see lesser sort of books of hours that have got annotations at the side, and you can see sometimes in the painting style, the way that the figures are painted, you can see that a particular artist has worked on these books of hours, and you can see a similar style being carried across, particularly the ones that are in France, the French books of hours. You can see the little figures, and you'll see them in many different settings. You'll see these same figures appear, and the same illustrations. You can see that obviously there is a set way of depicting the seasons of the year, the characters that are depicting the seasons of the year. So sort of people sat in front of the fire with their boots off, or people chasing sheep or whatever. You can see that these are set scenes, and so the actual style may change, the illustrator may change, but this is like a set scene of like, right now we're going to depict the month of May, and this is what happens in the month of May, and this is the set picture that we're going to use to depict the month of May. So yeah, books of hours, psalters, the Book of Kells, which is a book depicting the Gospels, like the Lindisfarne Gospels, they have set ways of setting out on a page the way that the script opens. So the very first word in that book, when you open it up, the very first word is the illuminated capital letter. So it's capitalized, and it's an art form in itself. And you almost don't need to read that as a piece of writing, because anybody who is speaking from that book, they know that off by heart. They know the beginnings of all those books. They don't need to read that word. So the fact that this is like such a complicated letter, you can't even see what it's meant to be, whether it's meant to be an A or a G or whatever. You see that as an art form. One of the things that I've been researching with my other work as a tile maker is one of the figures that I've been researching is from a Psalter, which is a book of Psalms, and it's the illuminated letter D that begins the phrase Dixit incepiens, and there's always a figure stood in the middle of the capital D, and I've been able to follow those capital Ds by searching in places like the Bodleian Library and the Ashmolean Library, places that hold all of these books and that have very kindly digitised them and put them online. And I see the same figure depicted in this capital D for Dixit incepiens, because the phrase is, the fool says in his heart there is no God, and it's always a particular form of fool. And so I was researching this image of a fool on tiles, and I was able, accidentally, through researching fools, I then found that these are depicted in this illuminated letter, this Dixit incepiens, and that's how I was able to understand that there is a particular sort of fool called a waferer who is shown juggling a communion wafer. So that's what I have depicted on my medieval tile, is a fool holding a communion wafer, and they were a particular set of fool called a waferer. They were part of the king's household. They had their own budget. They just served up at the end of the meal sweet wafers as a pudding course, and they juggled them. So they had their own kitchens, they had their own stoves, they had a budget of £50 a year, and they would follow the king's retinue, and at the end of his meal they would cook these wonderful sweet wafers for the company, and as they made their entrance with them, they would juggle them. And this is the figure that's depicted as standard in the big illuminated letter D that begins the phrase Dixit incepiens, the fool says in his heart there is no God. So that's the sort of level of familiarity that all of the scriptoriums, all of the people creating these documents around Europe, they all know that when you come to this particular psalm, the fool says in his heart there is no God, the standard practice is you depict a waferer waving a wafer in the air as if he's about to juggle it. And so this is part of what I love about really diving deep into these subjects, because it gives you an insight into how they saw the world and how they took things for granted that we have no awareness of in our modern world. We have no understanding of how they saw that. So this is a role that there are only very few people like Peterkin the Fool who have researched these sorts of particular jesters and jugglers, and they're lost from our knowledge. We're not aware that there was a whole troop of people who just had this role, and they're so familiar to everybody else in the medieval world that they know immediately on seeing this figure that that's the waferer. He's a fool. He's a particular sort of fool, but he's the king's fool. So that allows another layer of meaning, because by inferring that you've got the king's fool there depicted in an illuminated letter, they're perhaps saying that, if the king isn't careful, he can be thinking that he's greater than God, So it's like a little aside into that way of thinking. So that's what I love about researching this to that level.
Wow.
I like the sound of big illuminated letter Ds.
Yes.
Big illuminated letter Ds for Daniel. Yeah, they're easy to do as well. An illuminated D is much easier to do than an illuminated F, believe me. Much simpler, yeah.
Yeah, well, we've got a D and we've got a D. So,
you do? Yes, of course you do. Yes, of course you do.
So you mentioned monasteries.
Yeah.
It was monks and nuns and religious people who were making these books and illuminated letters.
They were to start with, yes. They were to start with because the households would have had more standard sort of writing being done. They would have had the accounts being done. They would have had laws being written, but they wouldn't have had illustrations being created. They wouldn't have had artists there as a standard part of a household. It's not until you get the royal households, you get to the royal households, that they are employing artists and they're employing illuminators. But the whole reason you have these is to create these books. And so the main people that are reading the books, that are disseminating the books as part of disseminating knowledge, is the monastery. So that's why you have it. It's from the top down, really. Later on, as you get later into the medieval period, then you do start getting printed books, and you get this halfway house between the totally handwritten Bibles and books into a crossover between printed books. But you have, I think they're called inunculus, but you'll have to look that up. There's a definite period of about 50 years where you've got big printed plates that are being carved onto a whole block of wood. So every single letter is carved in. So it's one entire block of print, not movable type at this stage. And they're leaving a big gap for someone to come along and illuminate that letter. So they're a mix, they're a bit of a crossover between the wholly illuminated, handwritten manuscript and the fully printed book. So they're a halfway house between the two for about 50 years in the sort of late 1300s. And then you get into the 1400s and they're starting to produce paper in Italy in much bigger quantities. And then you have Gutenberg, and then you have Caxton, and you have movable type. And all of a sudden, all bets are off. And so they're then printing onto paper. They're printing onto paper and they're using movable type. And then they're printing books on subjects that previously have not been written on. They've not been written, subjects on those books have not been written about before. And it's just at the period at the birth of the Renaissance, really. And it's the reason why the Renaissance happens, is because when you have printed books on paper, it's not just then the monasteries that are producing them. It's not just then the kings or the lord of the manor who has a book. You've then begun to have the middle classes can have their books, So you have the stage before that, you do have little illuminated almanacs. So you have these little tiny, I'm doing a zigzag motion with my hands, which you can't see, but I'm zigzagging my fingers in and out. You have these little tiny illuminated almanacs, and almanacs are sort of a household book that merchants would have had, farmsteads would have had, so sort of middling classes. You no longer have to own a castle in order to have one of these. And they are to help you set out your year and to set out the things that happen in your year. So they tell you that on this particular saint's day, that's the best day to plant your corn. On that particular saint's day, that's a good time to gather in your harvest. And they fold up into a little square, and you wear them on your side. You tuck them into a little case and you wear them on your side, and they are illuminated. They do have little illustrations in them, and they very often have embroidered covers. And some of them are medical almanacs, so they have medicines, they have recipes in, they have cures and ailments in them. But other times they are almanacs to do with the passing of the year and what to do. And so they aren't big books, but they are illuminated and they are scripted, they are written, and they're folded up pieces of parchment in a zigzag way. So they open out in a zigzag and then they open out the other way in a zigzag, and they're beautiful little things. And the Wellcome Institute in London has a big collection of them because they are medical textbooks. They're very early medieval textbooks on medicine, and so that's why they've got a collection. They've got a collection of those there. So they're a bit of a halfway house. So they're smaller, they're not whole books. And you do get personal prayer books as well. So Richard III was known to have a personal prayer book that he read from every night before he went into battle, and that survives. So we know what Richard III's prayer book looked like. So they don't have to be as big as the Book of Kells or as big as the Lindisfarne Gospels. They can be smaller and more personal, but they are all produced in a monastic setting. It's part of what brings the monastery their funds, their money.
Could you tell us a little bit about some of the pigments and the dyes and the inks that were used to make the letters and the rest of the books? Because some of these were really hard to get hold of, as I understand.
Yeah, some of them were. Some of them you were lucky enough they grow in hedgerows in the countryside. So your inks, your main ink that you use in a manuscript in the medieval period, right up until the Victorian period, is made from oak galls. And that's a little tiny round ball, and sometimes they're a little bit gnarly, but they're a different sort of gall. But the main one that we know of that the monks were using, the monasteries were using, is a little round gall, and it's made by a little wasp laying an egg into the tip, the very soft, juicy tip of an oak tree. So they're not trying to tunnel through the bark; they're going to where the new leaves are growing, and they're laying an egg in the end of that tip, and then the insect grows just underneath that skin of the oak tree, and the oak tree, in response to that, rather like when you get bitten by a mosquito, your skin makes a big red angry lump. The oak tree swells up around that little insect and forms this gall. And you find galls on all sorts of other plants, but the oak gall is really useful because oak trees and oak tree bark has tannin in it, and tannin is what you get. You get tannin in tea. That's why your teeth go yellow if, like me, you drink too much tea. But you get tannin in oak bark. And so what this oak gall produces with the result of because of the little insect living in it for a year and eating the juice, the sap of the oak tree, they're excreting concentrated tannin. And so at the end of the year, when they gnaw a little hole and their fully fledged wasp flies away to go and find another wasp, what you're left with is this beautiful little capsule of concentrated powdered tannin. And so you can chop that, crush it, and boil up some water and make this wonderful sort of pale brown liquid, which is basically the beginning of your oak gall ink. And then if you get hold of something called copperas, which is iron sulfate, which is a naturally occurring mineral, very high in iron. The iron then reacts with the tannin and turns it black. And so this is your oak gall ink. And this is what is in use in all of the manuscripts that you see written. They are all written with oak gall ink for the black ink. When you look at an illuminated manuscript, you have all of the black text, but the beginning of each of the sentences is usually a red letter, okay? And so that helps you when you're reading to keep your place, because if you've ever looked at a page of an illuminated manuscript, the normal text page, it just goes on and on and on and on, and all the letters are truncated, all the script is truncated, it's very often written in a sort of shorthand. So it can be quite difficult to keep your place. And so they helpfully put a red initial letter at the beginning of each sentence. And so that tells you when to take a breath and when a new sentence is starting. And so this red ink is made with something called Brazil wood. And Brazil wood is made from the bark of the Brazil tree. And interestingly, well, I think it's interesting, when they eventually got to South America, when people went to South America, they found the Brazil wood tree growing there. Well, this had already been growing in Europe, and they'd been making ink out of it for hundreds of years. So when they went to Brazil and they found the Brazil wood tree, they named the country Brazil after the ink. Okay, so it wasn't the other way around. It wasn't that they made the Brazil wood ink because it was found in Brazil. They named the country Brazil after the ink. as far as I know. Okay, so those are the two inks that are used, and they take up the majority of the pages in your Gospel and your Bible. And then the illuminated part of the manuscript, you're using mostly different minerals. You're using ground up minerals. Some of them are earth pigments that you find locally. You find them in this country. They are ochres. So you've got red ochre and yellow ochre, and these are forms of different iron oxide. These are quite clay rocks. You find them a lot on the coasts. So Anglesey, the cliffs in Anglesey, you'll find lots of ochres there. You find them in Cornwall. You find them in anywhere that you've got iron-rich rocks. So those are quite inexpensive because they're local to find. Then you've got another rock which is used to create green, which is malachite, which is another magical word. Malachite is a form of copper ore, and it was what was used in history. It had a massive impact on civilization because it was malachite that was smelted to form copper, which then when combined with tin makes bronze. So they made an entire industry. They named a whole era of mankind after this malachite ore. And so there's not as much in this country as there used to be because we were exporting it to Europe with our bronze tools. So that, if you grind that up, that forms a lovely a green. You can also then get another mineral rock, which is again naturally occurring, but it's not found in this country. It's found only in the medieval period. It's found in only one place in the world, and that's one particular mountain range in Afghanistan. So all of the paintings that you find, all the paintings that you see where you've got the Sistine Chapel ceiling by Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci's paintings, Lindisfarne Gospels, all of the blue that is used in those manuscripts comes from lapis lazuli, and it's traded. It's one of the most important things that's traded on what they call the Silk Route, which is where you've got merchants making their way through places like Italy and then down into Persia, and they're finding their way through all of these eastern countries into Afghanistan. And so this mineral is going to be changing hands many times on its way to the monastic setting, and by the time it gets to Britain, you're handing over more weight in gold than you're getting back in lapis lazuli. It's worth more than its weight in gold. And it's the entire reason that when you look at an illuminated manuscript and you see a statue of the Virgin Mary, she's depicted wearing a blue dress. And it's not because they believe that she was actually wearing blue. I think she'd have probably been wearing something like a sludge brown colour. But she's shown wearing blue because she is the most venerated person on that page, and they're wanting to show that she is the most valued person. So they're using the most precious mineral that they have in order to paint her blue. Otherwise they would paint her gold. She would be gilded, but she's not gilded, she's painted blue. And so this is why, is because that she's the most precious person on the page, and they want you to notice that. So that's why her statues are painted blue. She's blue in stained glass, and she's illuminated in blue on medieval manuscripts.
So we've mentioned illuminated manuscripts, but obviously that's not how we do it anymore. So why did it end?
Why did it end? There are some people still making them. Mm-hmm. There are some people still making them as precious objects. There are still some being commissioned as gifts, particularly our friends Uri and Katerina, who make shoes. They made a wraparound, a leather binding for a particular illuminated manuscript that was a gift to the Pope. So they did that a couple of years ago. So there are still some being made, but they're very, very rare. And they fell out of practice because really of the ability to disseminate the contents of what was in these illuminated manuscripts in a printed form so that ordinary people can see them. You have people, they've got Bibles on their nightstands in hotels. Bibles are prevalent throughout the world. It's still, I think, the most printed book in the world. It's the most commonly printed book in the world. So that's why they fell out of favour. But in this country in particular, they stopped being produced by monasteries when the monastics' houses collapsed as a result of the Reformation. So right up until the Reformation, they were still being made, they were still being produced, even if they were in this sort of half-printed, half-illuminated manuscript manner. But really with the Reformation and the closure of the abbeys and the monasteries in this country, they stopped being produced, so it became a secular activity.
The closure of the scriptoriums as well.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, the closure of the scriptoriums. Yeah, you only have scriptoriums as such within monastic houses. You do have schools of learning, so Cambridge and Oxford, the two big universities. Those are separate schools of learning, and you've got very old schools like the school in Canterbury, King's School in Canterbury, which has been going for almost 1,000 years. You've got that sort of seat of learning, but they aren't scriptoriums. They are not producing books in this way for production, for disseminating to other people. They'd be making books for in-house. They'd be copying books in-house and for students. So yeah, that's really why they stopped, was in this country, was the dissolution of the monasteries. When the monasteries ceased, then scriptoriums as we know them stopped. I'm not sure if there is a record of like the last book that was produced. I'm sure there will be, but I don't know what that would be. But yeah, the rise of the printed book, was really what did it. You do still get decorated books though from that period. It's just that they're secular. They're not wholly monastic. They're not wholly what we would call the books that are produced in scriptoriums. You've got people like Turner, who did his training as a colourman. So you've got in the 18th century, 17th century, 18th century, 19th century, you have people called colourmen who are carrying on that tradition, and they're colouring engravings, printed engravings in books. So you have these beautiful books. You've got examples in the Elizabethan period where people have gone out to America and they've documented all of these incredible plants and animals that nobody's ever seen before, beautiful birds, but they're doing copperplate engravings of those to reproduce them in bulk form, and then those are being hand coloured. So they've got several copies of that book. And so that's what takes over, is this sort of secular business of book production, printed book production, and colouring those book plates, those copper engraved book plates. So you do still get these beautifully, what you might call illuminated books, but they're no longer for this monastic purpose. They're no longer for the celebration and passing on of the different forms of Christian faith. You do actually get Jewish books that are illuminated. There are illuminated manuscripts that are Jewish. I've seen a reproduction of one that was from the 15th century, and they are written out and they do have illuminated letters, but they tend to have more of a pattern to them, and you do get illuminated Qurans. But again, those are beautiful calligraphic celebrations of lettering, rather than depicting like we have in the Christian tradition of having drawn figures. So you get beautiful illuminated Qurans that are, again, these beautifully illuminated letters, and they're very mathematical, they're very geometric in design. So yeah, so that's what happens, is that the scriptoriums close. The monastic scriptoriums close as a part of the dissolution of the monasteries. They still carry on overseas, they still carry on in Europe, but in England, in Britain, they fall by the wayside. And then you have the rise of printed books and the painted, illuminated pages of those, but it's a very different tradition. So yeah, Turner was a colourman. We know Turner for his watercolours. He was the first artist in this country to take what he'd been doing as an illuminated practice, which is to basically colour in copperplate engravings, and he would just be colouring in sheet after sheet after sheet, which would then be tipped into books, which is where you glue the printed copperplate into a plain page in a book. So that's glued along the edge and it's tipped in. You still see books have it now up until the Victorian period. So you have a printed book and then you glue this illuminated page in. Turner was the first artist to actually say this as a medium was something that was worth doing as an art form in itself. And he was derided and laughed at the time. But now watercolour is accepted as an artist practice. But then he was the first one to do it. So
that's very interesting. I did not know that.
Did not know that either.
There you go.
Before we finish, where can people go to find out more? If they want to find out more about scriptoriums or illuminated letters, what are some of the best places you've found?
Oh, gosh. Well, if you want to read about the practice of making the materials, if you want to read about how the paints were prepared, how artist studios were run, and how all different sorts of art forms were produced, I can recommend a book written by a person called Cennini, which is Cennini, Alberto Cennini. And he was an Italian writing in the mid to late 1400s, so probably about 1470. And Dover Press produced a reproduction of his book, and it's really readable. He wrote it while he was in a debtor's prison. He'd been thrown in for not paying his bills. And while he was in there, he decided to set down all of his knowledge. And this is just at the point at which books are being printed containing this sort of knowledge, this sort of awareness that wasn't set down before. And so you can pick up secondhand copies of this Dover Press publication. I think it's called A Craftsman's Handbook. And that gives you an absolute sort of 15th century eye view on how to prepare everything from the bowl that you need to prepare for your ground to then gild onto, to how to grind up your pigments, how to make oak gall ink, how to then go on and make stained glass windows, how to do full body casts, how to make sculptures, how to cast bronze. He really covered every single art form. So that, and you do have to take some of it with a pinch of salt, because he was being deliberately obscure, rather like our alchemist, who will tell you 80% of a process and then put 10% in of something that's completely wrong and won't get you anywhere. That's exactly what Jack, our alchemist, does. Cennini was a little bit similar to that in some cases, so you do have to take it with a pinch of salt, but he will tell you how to prepare your ground, how to prepare your parchment. And so that is an absolute sort of from the horse's mouth, how to actually do that from the 15th century point of view. If you want to then look online and find examples of these books, I would recommend looking at just searching for the Book of Kells, searching for the Lindisfarne Gospels, and you will find where these books are held, the museums that hold them. They will have pages on how these are prepared.
Well, thank you very much for once again joining us at the Alnwick Castle Podcast.
Thank you very much for having me again.
It's always great to talk to Karen about the medieval world. If you'd like to see Company of Artisans in action at Alnwick Castle, please go to alnwickcastle.com to find out when they're next appearing. And check out what's on board during your next visit, as Scriptorium talks take place throughout the season in Artisans Courtyard.
If you enjoyed this episode and would like to hear more from Karen, you can find her speaking to me about medieval tiles in episode 15 and medieval alchemy in episode 21.
Don't forget to subscribe to Alnwick Castle Podcast so you don't miss any future episodes, and we'd be grateful if you can recommend the podcast to your family and friends.
We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode, but until then, I've been Daniel.
And I've been Deborah.
Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.
Bye.